Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink, and to celebrate World Kindness Day, Honeybee Stamps is having a sale, and a bunch of the design team members all got together to create cards using their Kind and Kindness stamps and dies. So I decided to make a video for mine because it's just force of habit after all this time. And I couldn't resist pulling out the Zen Bouquet stamp set. I've already done a couple of videos with this set and I just love it. I reach for it so often. So I have some Canson XL watercolor paper and I put it in my regular size MISTI. And I used my anti-static powder tool on it first. And then I stamped the image with VersaMark ink. And then I am coating it with the Nuvo Classic Gold embossing powder. It's actually my first time using this particular color of embossing powder. I've used a few of their other ones and I really like them. This one, honestly, I was even more surprised at just how much I liked it. When I poured it on, I was kind of like, yeah, I'm not really too sure how I'm going to feel about this one. But when I melted it, it's hard to explain how the color, one, slightly changed. I would almost call it like a vintage gold. It's not a bright gold, and I wouldn't really call it an antique gold. It's a different shade of gold, but the biggest takeaway from this is not only is it pretty, but it smooths like I don't think I've ever seen an embossing powder smooth out this nicely. So anyway, I melted it with my heat tool, and it's all gorgeous. You could almost leave it like that, just because I just thought it turned out so perfectly. But I'm still rather obsessed with my faux Distress Ink watercoloring, aka just rubbing my Distress Ink pads directly onto the paper and spraying with water. I love doing this. It's so fun and it always turns out different. And honestly, when I started this card, my original intention was to use very bright fall colors, you know, jewel tones, like really deep and go bright. You guys know I like the bright. But I pulled out colors I never reached for, which was Antique Linen, Tattered Rose, Victorian Velvet, and Tea Dye. And rubbed those onto the paper, sprayed it with water, sprayed it liberally with water. And the last time I did this, I had mentioned how if you have the patience, you know, let it sit and dry, you get a totally different effect. One, didn't have the patience when I made this. Two, I literally didn't have the time. So, and also I mentioned like not touching it. Do whatever works for you. I break my own rules. I tell myself not to do things and I did it. And I was actually really glad I did it with this. I don't think using my heat tool to speed up the drying process really affected it much at all. And I did use my fingers to just kind of pull the color here and there, and I had fun with it, and I was totally happy with the end results. So I had it completely dry, and then I cut it in half with my little Tonic, Tim Holtz Tonic paper trimmer, because I wanted to get 2 cards out of this. And I cut it in half so I could run both pieces through with one of the A2 double stitch frame honey cut dies. And I've set those aside and I'm working on my sentiments. And of course I'm using the Kindness die set from Honeybee Stamps. And I die cut that multiple times from some really pale pink ink. This is Insulation Pink from My Favorite Things. And 2 of the die cuts I left inside the negative pieces of cardstock, because that enabled me to kind of hold these in place so I could sponge ink over them. And I'm using the same inks I used for my faux watercoloring. So this part I'm using the Tattered Rose. I'm kind of inking it up from the bottom and almost ombre effect. And then I'm adding a little bit of the Victorian Velvet to the very bottom of the sentiment to give it that ombre effect, and also to kind of pull the color in together, and also to make the sentiment stand out a bit, because this cardstock is very pale and it's going to go on top of, you know, the watercolor background I did. So I'm going to stack these together. I stacked 2 layers of just the regular cardstock die cut, and then I'm going to top that with the one I'd sponged. And I'm just using my Ranger Multi-Medium Matte Adhesive. I've got my little applicator in here, and I just apply the adhesive to like the largest areas of the sentiment. I don't coat the entire thing. There's no need for it. As long as there's enough on there that it holds it all down, once this dries, it's good to go. So these dies come as the word kind, and then you have 2 options. You can die cut the ending in "ness" or "est," depending on what sentiment you're building, because Honeybee is known for having tons of sentiments. So I chose kindness for both my cards, but with all the stamps and everything else, depending on what sentiment you want to build, you've got that option. So I did that to both sentiments, and then I have another piece of that Insulation Pink cardstock, and I'm stamping sentiments from the Coordinating Kindness stamp set. And I've got them lined up on my block. I'm doing the exact same thing, my anti-static powder tool, and then inking up the sentiments with VersaMark ink. And then I'm coating it with that same gold embossing powder. And again, I was really impressed with, as it melted, it smoothed out so nicely. I find certain powders sometimes are almost, they're still very gritty even after you've melted them. Like you need to do more than one coat if you're doing large images, etc., etc. I don't know. I was just really impressed by this powder today. I've had a lot of people asking me what I think of the Nuvo powders, and I think they're great. All the ones I've tried so far, I've been really impressed with. So after I had heat embossed the sentiments on the strips of cardstock, I trimmed those down again with my little Tonic trimmer. And then I'm going to adhere the die cut words here to my watercolor paper. So same thing, that multimedia matte adhesive. And since I'm adhering it to watercolor paper and there's also embossing in the way, everything else, I need to either hold it down with my fingers, or after I get the first part of the word, the kind, in place and the little dot to the eye, I'm just going to put a couple of acrylic blocks on there just to hold that down so that the glue has a chance to fully adhere to the watercolor paper. And I'm doing the same thing with the second part of the sentiment here, and just picking it up with my reverse tweezers and then lining it up. And this is how you can build your sentiment to create what version of the word you need for your phrase on your card. So I've got those adhered, and then I'm going to start adhering the little banner parts to complete the sentiment. So for this one, I just cut a little flag end with my scissors, and I just popped little bits of narrow foam tape here so I can pop that into place. And then for the second card, it was a little simpler. I just had to adhere the one word above and then the remaining sentiment below it, so I didn't have to do any trimming or anything like that. So once I have all of those in place, I had trimmed down some Simon Says Stamp, their glitter paper. It's the champagne, yes, the champagne glitter cardstock. So I trimmed 2 pieces down to slightly larger than the watercolor paper, and I trimmed out the insides because, especially with glitter paper, when I don't have a whole lot of it, I like to conserve what I've got. And I know it really bothers people, you know, when you use a full sheet. I honestly don't mind personally, but that's also because I have a lot, you know, I have a lot of stock, a lot of cardstock, all that kind of stuff. But this is one way to kind of conserve, and also works with cardstock if you don't have a whole lot of cardstock on hand, is to save those center pieces, and then you can use them for other cards or for die cutting, etc., etc. So I am using my little Xyron tape runner to apply adhesive all around the edge of the watercolor paper, and then I can press that down onto my glitter frame and get that adhered into place. And then I'm going to set those aside for a minute here and work on my card bases, which is that same insulation pink cardstock. So I cut a sheet of that cardstock in half, scored it at 5.5 inches. So these will be top folding A2 size cards. And I'm lining them up again in my MISTI because I want to stamp the sentiment. This is from the Honeybee Stamps Forest Friends stamp set. I really love the sentiment, and I love the fonts and everything. So I had to use that to kind of finish off these cards. So I lined it up in my MISTI, and I'm using the anti-static powder tool again, and then I'm going to heat emboss both these sentiments with that same gold embossing powder. So I closed the lid of the MISTI, stamped the sentiment, I'm going to coat it with the embossing powder, then I'm going to set that aside and do the exact same thing to the second card base. So I've got both stamped, both coated with embossing powder. I let my heat tool heat up for about a minute, and then melted both of these with my heat tool. And I did the sentiment first because I want to stamp that Zen Bouquet background stamp on the inside of the cards. So I wanted to make sure the sentiments were done first, so I don't have to fiddle and worry about the embossing powder sticking to anything it's not supposed to. So after I had them both heat embossed, I'm actually going to line up the large Zen Bouquet stamp again, and I'm going to just have both cards lined up on my MISTI so I can stamp this all at once. Doesn't matter that the cards are kind of hanging off my MISTI here. Sorry about the weird camera angle. I've literally have like the lid of the MISTI almost in my lap because my desk is not big enough. I don't have enough workspace. Although, again, if you guys have been watching my videos for any length of time, you know I'm just a mess. I'm not professional with my videos at all. I have a mess going on my desk, as you can see. I don't have enough clear space to make everything clean. That's just how it works. Things are usually on the floor. So I inked up the lid of the MISTI with the same insulation pink ink, just because if I inked up with just VersaMark, you won't really see it. VersaMark doesn't show up very well on really pale cardstock. So I used the same ink to stamp that Zen Bouquet just to finish off the insides of the cards. And then I popped the card fronts onto the card bases with some foam tape. And then as a final bit of embellishment, I was just going through some of my different sequins and I came across this coral shell sequin mix from Honeybee, and the colors were perfect for these. So I just pulled out a few for each card, lay them out where I wanted them, and I'm just going to pick them up with my little jewel picker here and adhere them into place with little dabs of that same multi-medium matte adhesive. And that finishes off both of my cards. So I will have a link below the video to my blog post. I'll have info about the sale because the stamps and dies are on sale today only. Apologies if you're watching this in the future, but I always update my sales and coupons page on my blog with current codes and sales and all that stuff. So definitely check out my blog if you are interested. And I have a link to the Honeybee blog as well because there's tons of inspiration for this. So you can check that out too. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye.